Vihersalo. I'm from the University of Helsinki and working there as a researcher. And I'm going to discuss with the topic of childhood, youth, and substance abuse, substance addiction, marginalizing welfare service systems. Most of you probably work and think of the present, but in my presentation I will look a little bit back in the histories of these youngsters also. And my presentation is based on an ethnography done at a shelter in the metropolitan area of Helsinki in April, May 2022, so it was last spring, with young people aged 18 to 29. And instead of purely practical focus, my interest here is also sociological. So I'm interested also in belonging, education, and responsibility in society. So in the question of do these, that's my kid. He has this emergency access to me. Get through even though I have my phone quiet. So do they belong to society? And what does society do to keep them in the society? And have these kids, children, young people been inside the circle of care and education? Are they part of society or are they excluded outside of it? So, and if so, where and when does this exclusion happen? I will do this by sharing you 3 stories, pseudonyms Tiina, Tarmo, and Timo, and reflect the histories of these kids through Tiina's, Tarmo's, and Timo's stories. A few words about me and my background and how it relates to the research questions. I had no previous background in substance abuse research before. My background is in family studies and gender studies. And my focus has been mainly on middle class, normativity, citizenship, welfare state, and particularly how modern family became a center of family politics. I have, my dissertation was about nuclear family politics in 2009. So that was kind of the downside of my background. And the good thing about this was that it was the ethnography and the observations. There was quite a big shock effect, which is, when doing ethnography, is also quite a good thing. So you see often more clearly when you come as an outsider. And the contrast between the issues of middle-class family and upbringing of a middle-class children and youngsters is quite a big thing here. When you are in middle of kids with no home and struggling with substance abuse. So it ended up being a good thing, even though it was first quite a shock. Few words about the background of the project. It was started by Anna Leppo and Riikka Perälä, and I joined the project a year ago in January 2022. And the original aim of the sub-study I was supposed to do through interviews was to find out the welfare service system experiences of these homeless youngsters with substance abuse problems. So my aim was to interview homeless young people with substance abuse problems at a low threshold shelter where they provided kids with a place to stay, food, washing and laundry facilities, clean equipment, service counseling, and through partners, for example, advice on housing. I had some serious problems with silence. The kids wouldn't talk to me. I had this kind of, I would say it was a middle class perspective on speaking and sharing your opinions, that I kind of thought that I just come there, I stay there 1 week, maybe 3 weeks, and they will have, if they have opportunity to talk, they will tell me of their experiences, share their experiences, kind of have the opportunity to share their experiences, and they will do it. So I had to solve the problem, and I solved by changing the interviews that I was supposed to do in maximum of 3 weeks to ethnography, which you probably all know, but it means that you stay there in the field, as we call it in research, and observe, hang out. So I hung out there for 2 months, in April to May last spring. And eventually I found also interviewees through the shelter with different backgrounds. So altogether 6 of them, plus 2 group interviews of people working with the kids. So with my background and the background of the study, the research questions reformulated a bit. And I also, in addition to the welfare service experiences, I also asked, how did this happen? So when hanging around, took the habit of asking whenever someone would have the time to discuss with me and be part of my questionnaires. I would ask also, mainly the people working with the kids, that what should have happened differently so that those young people would not be there right now. I often got the answer something like, it should have happened a long time ago. In childhood, maybe in school. Child protection, that should be blown up. So when I eventually did get the interviewees as well, I did not only ask their service system experiences, but if they were willing, I listened to the life stories they had with the perspective of does our society hold on to these kids, or does it exclude them and actively make them outsiders? So I asked if they got help, and what did the adults do around you when you faced these issues? So I paid attention to age because they were quite young. Some of them younger than others, but anyways, young enough to kind of not to be able to forget that when something happened and they needed help, they were pretty young. So we all know that both in the public debate and among substance users themselves, an idea persists that one situation is a result of one's own choices. However, their age, the presumed choice maker here, has been, when making choices, a minor. So their age obliges to look at also responsibility of the situations. So the question is, at what point is the child and young person responsible for him or herself? Does it happen at 18th birthday or before that? if so, when? When does it happen? So I'm questioning the moral assumption of an individual who is fundamentally responsible for his or her own actions and whose situation is purely the result of his or her own individual choices. So was the minor responsible of him or herself, or should the question of responsibility be approached from a different angle? So interest in relationship of responsibility and age. So the age of the actor obliges to look also at the relationship between him, her, the adults around him, her, and service systems, especially the power and responsibility relations, and to consider the young person's limited resources in a broad and fundamental way. So what happened before and during the early stages of substance abuse problems? So instead of and alongside harm reduction and rehabilitation work, I here pay attention to service systems more broadly. The relationship between the child / young person, youngster, their education, and the adults around them and belonging to the society. A particular interest I have is in the active marginalizing practices, thus marginalizing done actively and not happening somewhere passively. And this calls into question the idea that exclusion is random, passive, and driven solely by the actions of the child and young person happening somewhere we don't know where. So I pay attention to structures and rationalities in general and the welfare service systems in particular. What part do they play in these stories? So I will introduce pseudonyms Tiina, Tarmo, and Timo and discuss responsibility, education, and belonging to the community in dialogue with their stories. I'm interested in belonging, education, and responsibility in society. How are us and them made up, produced? When does it start? Where? Where does it and how does it happen that they become them wandering around streets and we are somewhere else in the society with service system and everything is kind of made up for us. We know that when we need something, we know what to do and what kind of rights we have. And who is education for? Who is society for? Are some of us excluded from it? And if so, when and where does it happen? So through these few examples, 3 examples, I look in detail at the relationship between the child or young person, child because some of them are children when something happened, and the adults around them, particularly welfare service systems and belonging to the community. And so here, first interviewee, first but quick peek in Finnish at her story, as it kind of feels more real in the original language, but here it is in English. And you probably didn't have time to read it at all, but that's not a problem. The translation here. So, pseudonym Tiina. I thought that if I could get to that rehab, all my problems would be solved. But no, the desire to use drugs doesn't go away even if you get a medication once a day. Did you get anything else? Help? Well, some counseling with the nurse, but if you use drugs, it was always about you shouldn't use them. And in my opinion, they didn't really think about the reasons. And I also remember that when I went to the outpatient clinic, my nurse was a pretty busy woman. I had a traumatic event in my mind that happened to me when I was 14 years old. It was something that lingered a lot in my mind at the time. So I just told her about it, and I remember when she said that, yeah, well, you should get over it, that it doesn't help that you're thinking about it. And it was probably true, but when I told her that I hadn't discussed it anywhere, do you want to tell me what it was? I was raped. It was my first time like sexual intercourse. 2 men raped me. So this is the first theme, the welfare service systems. We have here a 14-year-old and she's being raped. When the interviewee first raises the issue a few years later, around aged 18, the nurse at the outpatient clinic says that the issue should be dealt with. How? She does not give the young person support or tools. Instead, she draws attention to the fact that she should not use drugs. The interviewee did not receive any support to deal with this issue in the years to come, not from anywhere else either. After the requests for help, her drug use went from weekend use to more regular use. The theme of prioritization of substance abuse in welfare systems is often mentioned in research on these welfare service system experiences of substance abusers. So also in the interviews and in ethnography, the prioritization of the substance abuse problem was a recurring theme in young people's stories. The rationalities of health and social services put the substance abuse problem first before other problems. Other health issues are not addressed easily unless the substance abuse problem is solved first. So as a result, mental health and health-related problems are often ignored and the substance abuse problem is put first. For example, there were so many stories of neglected treatment of hepatitis C that neglect seemed to be the norm rather than an exception. And Tina's willingness to talk about her rape-related anxiety is a good example of ignoring a mental health issue of someone with substance abuse problem. And here our second pseudonym, Tarmo, quick peek at his transcription in Finnish and in English. Tarmo is telling that I've probably been to about 6 different schools and homeschooling and stuff like that during primary school. And then there's something else. I read some old epicrises from the time I was 7 years old, and I don't remember anything about them. For example, I read something about how I'm really scared and how I'm afraid of everything. And something I said about vampires and demons and some apocalyptic scenarios and stuff like that. Do you know if your parents tried to get you help back then? Well, my mother did try to get me help, but she was a single parent of 4 children and like this. And my dad was he didn't know how to be a father. When I was in the 3rd grade, my mother couldn't cope with me anymore because I refused to go to school because I always got a stomach ache because I was so anxious. And how did the teachers treat you when you were little and you were anxious? Well, back then, When I moved to my father's place in that small town, the class teacher had said to the other parents at the parents' evening that don't let your children play with Tarmo, he's a disturbed child. And this is how it was. How old were you then? I was in the 3rd grade, and the middle school kids beat me up if I bumped into them there in the village, and all kinds of stuff. He continues. I was homeschooled for most of primary school. Who taught you? No one. I didn't even read those school books. I'm just a basic smart kid and I managed to pass my exams. But still, I always got 7s, 8s. So you read along? Yeah. Theme 2 would be school. So, Tarmo here tells of his school years, which were marked by moving, changing schools, bullying, teachers' indifference, and being an outsider. In Tarmo's story, the teacher identifies Tarmo, a 3rd grader, as a source of the problem. And the role of the community around him and the role of its in Tarmo's behavior is not addressed at all. The adults in the school see through the child's loneliness and need for help. Anxiety and fears are not explored or treated. Parents seek help. Single mother runs out of strength. Father didn't know how to be a father. In Tarmo's words. One of the solutions sought was long periods of homeschooling when, according to Tarmo, no one thought him. ADD and Asperger's diagnosis he got as a teenager, so he was diagnosed later, a theme that seems to be very common among people with substance abuse. Diagnosed or undiagnosed, and care that you don't have care for that. So he started substance abuse as a teenager, and he describes how substance abuse regulates his social skills, apathy, paralysis, anxiety, and emotional oversensitivity. Here, our 3rd youngster, Timo. So, kind of 3rd type of story. And in English, sorry, you didn't have probably time. I just feel that I need to show their own stories, own words in their own language first. But here in English, when did you go into a child protection institution? I was 11 at the time. The day before I turned 18, I got out. What do you have to say about that? The thing is, it only made things worse. It doesn't work if you put a lot of stupid people in the same place, so nothing smart can come out of it. That's where I first tasted pot, where I first took my injection, where I started to break away, hatkailla, and got to know older ones through that. It all started from there. So theme 3 would be child protection. In the institution, Timo had lived with other kids in similar situations who had also been taken into custody. And his drug use had started there. When I was 13, I started injecting drugs, so I've been doing them for a long time. When I was 11, I started smoking pot. So, in addition, he started to run away from the institution, as well as got to know young people and adults older than himself. And he tells that limitless behavior, his words, had led to restrictions on contact and freedom of mobility, acronyms UPR and LVR in Finnish, And he explains that it means that there is no way out. The longest LVR and UPR were 1.5 years. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere alone or call anywhere else but by anyone else but my mom or my brother or my sister. So he doesn't talk about the time before he was placed in a child protection institution, but the interview reveals that his relationship with his mother is very close and important to him. His mother also has a serious substance abuse problem. So the question of generationality appears both in the interview and in the corridor discussions with Timo. Between the lines, we could read the fourth theme, early family support. So there's tired single mothers, drinking and abusing fathers, fear in the families, helpless and tired parents with children in need of help, or parents having problems themselves they do not want to deal with or do deal with but don't get help. But so these are themes that came up also in the interviews. So from the perspective of family politics, these might also be middle class and outside the range of social work. Thus, historically, one of the cornerstones of self-supportive family has been the economic independence. So families with economic independence are traditionally not in the scope of social work. So it's the kind of old thinking is that economically independent families have not been in the radar of social work. They are kind of easily transparent to it. So further questions based on stories shared by Tiina, Tarmo, and Timo. First, welfare service system rationalities and the questions that kind of pop up. What kind of, or needs to be asked, what kind of understanding of humanity, child nurture and education, or motives for substance use in the rationalities of service systems has made it possible for minors with complex problems to be excluded from help, support, care, education, services in the community. Interesting and important is also the contrast to middle-class, family-centered educational thinking and service system relations. So we kind of need to ask, who are services made for? We need to ask also that, do we have welfare state safety nets? And who does belong to community? Are these children and young people with complex problems getting the education, care, and protection that children and young people deserve given their age? Do the solutions here, for example, keep the children and young people in the community, or do they exclude them, make them kind of outsiders? And of course, their age makes obliges to keep attention also on nurture and education. Does education also concern children and young people with complex problems? Or is it reserved only for class children? So, towards the end, the minor and the person being responsible for raising an education. And he defines that the principle of pedagogical respect, which requires
absolute respect for the humanity of the person being educated is the ethical guideline of education. Education must be constructive, supportive, and understanding, and must keep space for the person being educated. It is thus based on encounter and on responsible and respectful guidance. So although the other party is a minor and inevitably in an imbalanced power relationship with the adult, his or her experience and interpretation of the world is taken seriously. He or she will be seen and heard as human being. So the point of dialogical education is that you do not use the power you could use, even though you do have it. So, have these children, youngsters, been inside the circle of care and education? Instead of education, they seem to have been subject to interventions determined by the functional goals, for example, non-drinking or non-drug using, effective learning, disciplined behavior, together with an authoritarian approach to education. No consideration is given to the root causes of the minor symptoms, such as anxiety, loneliness, uncertainty, insecurity, or traumatic experiences, or to the imbalance of power, responsibility, or resources in relation to adult. If there has been some work considering the root causes, there is no mark of that work in the stories of these youngsters. Rather, there have been a tendency to socialize young people through restriction, isolation, and exclusion. So it's questionable whether the humanity of the person being socialized is respected. The principle of dialogue has not been respected. So, according to Varri, if we lean on his definition of what is education, this is not education at all. So they haven't been inside scope of education. He also defines the educational goal as building capability to act with growing independence and self-responsibility. According to Varri, education is only ethically justified when it is in line with the ideals of good life and becoming oneself. So the aim of education is the independence of the child and the ability to take responsibility of his or her own future. So the point is kind of for the educator to make him or herself useless and make the next generation independent and responsible of their capable of taking care of themselves. So on this basis, the history of young people with substance abuse problems lacks the most important educational objective: the gradual strengthening of the young person's capacity to independent action and responsibility. So if we think of many skills they lack, we also need to take into count also the fact that they have not been given the tools they need in life. So can the responsibility of being marginalized and being left out of tools needed in society remain to the young persons of themselves? So the big question is that what are the consequences consequences of lack of education. And we could also say that they are excluded from community, as the history of a young person is often young person with substance abuse problem is often one of isolation and exclusion. He or she has not grown up within a community and into a community, but outside the community and at its margins. He or she has not been allowed to belonging in the community. So the child / youngster is also excluded and marginalized by services provided to community members. So when discussing marginalization, we need to keep eye on active marginalizing practices and look critically at society and welfare services and not think of marginalization as something passive. This is actually something that I was highlighted in the field as we say. There were excellent and very, very sharp people working with these kids, and they had great amount of important points of view. And this is one of them. It's not something happening in passive, it's something done actively. Our children and young people excluded from nurture and education and community and from their agency and potential citizenship. The actively exclusionary mechanisms of service systems are particularly interesting. Where and how is the dependency and citizenship of the marginalized generated? Where does it happen and how is it accepted? Of that, we had here a few examples. So, to sum up, children and young people with complex problems are isolated from education, from the community, and from the services available to community members. Marginalization had often started at a young age and often before the substance abuse problem. Problems often have their roots in the basic services like early childhood education, school, healthcare, family work, early intervention, child protection, which have failed to address and respond to the services and needs of children, young people and their families who are vulnerable or at risk of exclusion. In addition to substance abuse policies or services, understanding young people's substance abuse problems and related harmful effects require a holistic approach to the functioning of service systems and their involvement in the problematic situation of these institutions. Thank you. Here are a few publications that about these issues. The first two are short ones, a blog and a essay, and the two in the middle are in print, and then there's the next one coming up is a manuscript, and then there's few more in the making. The collected material was huge, and it's kind of makes possible to discuss the issue